Okay. Shalom, Chavirim. Thank you very much, Len and Phil, for the invitation to participate. It's a great honor to participate in this great occasion. The perplexing problems of the literary structure of the guide and how to explain the discrepancies remain a problem. And I think that the authors, both Len and Phil, correctly take on Leo Strauss's very fanciful explanations um, in these in his two major articles, The Literary Character of the Guide and How to Begin to Study the Guide. Now, there are two problems that I'd like to address. Number one, Strauss bases his theory on a literary structure of units based on chapter numbers. And second, in his third introduction, Lieberman states that the guide was written over time and that Rambam changed his mind. However, as we all know, the guide Rambam explicitly denies this in that he changed his mind and claims that discrepancies result from the fifth cause pedagogic and the seventh cause deliberate concealment. So let's start with the chapter numbers. Avram Avulafia, Yosef ibn Kaspi, Don Yitzchak Barbanel all say that part one, chapters 26 and 27 are one chapter with the result that there are 177 chapters, which works out as Gan Eden. When I first saw that, I said, I wonder if they're correct. Not that I doubt that they knew arithmetic. So I went to the shelf and I saw, of course, that our versions have 178 chapters. But then it turns out that Shem Tov Ibn Falakera, in his Moreh HaMoreh, a title, by the way, that Len borrowed for his own wonderful companion volume, Falakera says explicitly that Samuel Ibn Tibbon made these two into one chapter, then corrected them, and then later separated them. And in a letter to Rambam regarding the questions of translation, Ibn Tibbon also explicitly stated that he numbered the chapters, and he did this, number one, to aid Rambam in answering questions about whatever passage he was asking. Number two, to aid him in finding those places, and number three, to aid anyone who is studying the book. So the number chapters definitely, and possibly even the number division, the chapter divisions go back to Shmuel ibn Tibbon and not to Rambam. Now, if you look at the text of those that one or two chapters, you can say that the flow, well, it could be two chapters or it could be one chapter in terms of the flow. It's not a clear question. And then many years ago, this is over something like over close to 40 years ago, when I came across this, you know that in the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts at the Jewish National Library, usually you take a manuscript and you spend hours, if not days or even longer, on one page. But all I wanted to know was, is there a break at this point? And if is the word perek or fasal integral in the text, or is it a later marginal addition? And so within a few hours, I took out 50 microfilms, which is probably a record for that kind of thing. And the bottom line was, it's not clear one way or the other. The evidence is not clear whether this should have been or should not have been one chapter or two chapters. Now, why would Rambam, a master of literary style and structure, why would he not number the chapters? It seems kind of elementary. In his Book of the Commandments and in the Mishneh Torah, you see very clearly a geometrical, structured, and numbered book. And there, in the introduction to the commentary of the Mishnah and in the introduction to the Mishneh Torah, Rambam states explicitly that a clear and logical structure facilitates limud al peh, memorizing or learning by heart. But in the guide, he explicitly stated that he wanted to restrict the study to the intelligentsia. So if a clear and logical literary structure can facilitate learning, what he said in those two other works, then by analogy, perhaps he deliberately refrained from numbering the chapters in this work because he didn't want to make it easy to study. Now we come to the second question: concealment by omission. That what's said is no less what is not said is no less important than what is said. If you'll take, please, the pages of texts that I asked to be handed out, you'll see very clearly, first of all, in the laws of Hanukkah, if you just look at the paragraph there, the two rabbinic passages have a phrase, nasa bones, that's missing in Rambam's quotation of these passages. He quotes almost word for word the two rabbinic sources, and then he skips nasa bones. I don't think that one can suggest that that's an accident. Then, if you look at the second text, where I compare what he says about the character of Job in part 3, chapters 22 and 23, and then what he says about the perplexed student in the introduction, we see that much of it is very, very clearly parallel in the phrasing and in the meaning. I'm not going to go through this now. You have the text in front of you. But Rambam never says that he never says this. He just does it. Once again, there's a clear lesson here, at least in my understanding, but Rambam says nothing about it. If you then look at the third and final text, in this case it's not Rambam, but it's Mendelssohn as opposed to Ibn Ezra. Wherever Ibn Ezra gets into a hint of what we would call higher Bible criticism, questioning the Mosaic authorship of the Torah, wherever he does that, Mendelssohn is totally silent. Even when he's quoting Ibn Ezra on that particular verse, on something technical like a grammatical point or an explanation of a word. And so, once again, it is precisely the silence that is deafening. And the chart shows that very clearly. Now, of course, you don't have to wait until Mendelssohn to raise that point, because Ibn Ezra himself engaged in omission. For example, in his famous commentary on Genesis 12:6, V'haknani az ba'aretz, then the Canaanite was in the land, he points out that if then means at that time, but not now, supposedly at the time of Moses, the now meaning the time of Moses, when there were Canaanites in the land, he says it has a secret meaning and the intelligent should keep silent. Maskil yidom. And so the silence is again pretty clear. Now Spinoza had already observed in chapter 8 of the Tractatus, the theological political Tractatus, that Ibn Ezra did this. And he said that that's because he couldn't say it openly, and therefore he had to use only hints to show what he means. And of course, the difference is that whereas Ibn Ezra could only hint at the question of the non-Mosaic authorship, a later authorship of the Pentateuch, Spinoza could do it openly and blatantly. And now we come to the next question. All right, there are these problems, the chapter divisions, the chapter numberings, what was said, what was not said. But the question is, was Rambam aware of all these problems? And I want to give some examples of my attempt to understand what Rambam was or wasn't doing, and was he or was he not aware? It's already been mentioned that in the second part of the guide, the introduction and the first chapter, where he talks about the proofs of God's existence and his incorporeality and unity, 3 of the 4 proofs are cosmological. And then he says that ultimately creation, he says this in part 2, chapter 17, but ultimately the question of creation versus eternity cannot be demonstrated conclusively and scientifically, because no inference can be made ex post facto from a state of actuality before a system exists to its nature in a state of potentiality. Now, Falakera in his commentary on 171, sharply criticizes Rambam on this. And he says, I say that one must question how something great like this can be explained on the basis of something dubious, let alone on something that's not true. For if the premises of a proof are not true, how can its conclusion be true? There is no doubt that our teacher was aware of this. That's my point. According to Falakera, Rambam was aware of the problem. Well, was he aware of the problem? Is this a discrepancy in his thought? Or is this a case of a pedagogic concealment by omission? We'll return to this later. In a different case, Rambam clearly came to be aware of a problem. As you know, he had not included creation in his 13 principles. Now, Falakera also explicitly states that Rambam believed in creation, which was one of the 13 principles. I don't know on what basis Falakera said that, but in Rabbi Yosef Kafich's Arabic and Hebrew edition of the commentary in the Mishnah, he brings a marginal note that Rambam later added in his own hand as to why he didn't include creation in the 13 principles. He said, know that the great foundation of the Torah is that the world is created. God made and created it after absolute non-being. The fact that you see me dealing with the eternity of the world according to the opinion of the philosophers in order that the proof of his existence be absolute. So I expounded and explained in the guide. Now, so that may be the basis of Falakera's unequivocal statement. However, there may be a totally different explanation for at least some of these problems of discrepancies in the guide. Rambam may not have changed his mind, something that he denied, but may have come to see that what he wrote, despite all his efforts, had been misunderstood and misrepresented. So therefore, it's not that he changed his mind, but he later felt compelled to add a clarification, not because he changed his mind, but because he'd been misunderstood. Now, a controversial case in point would also be his essay on resurrection, however unconvincing that essay may be, and as Daniel Jeremy Silver put it famously in his book on the Maimonidean controversy, on the question of resurrection, Maimonides squirmed even as he affirmed. In the case of creation, however, Rambam may have correctly come to the conclusion that his treatment of the topic, not mentioning it explicitly in the 13 principles earlier, and later basing his arguments for the existence, incorporeality, and unity of God in the second part of the guide, had simply confused and misled people. In other words, there's no real discrepancy here, no change of Rambam's mind, merely a later attempt to clarify what he'd written to correct a perceived misunderstanding. But maybe there's yet another way of looking at it. Another case involving Rambam's 13 principles, in this case, is the seventh principle on prophetic visions. Rambam stated there that the Shi'ur Koma would come into these matters, a topic for which even if I were extremely brief, 100 pages would not suffice, so I didn't deal with it. And so eminent scholars, including my teacher, Alexander Altman, Saul Lieberman, and Moshe Idel, all concluded that in his youth, Rambam believed in the Shi'ur Koma, this text that ascribes astronomical measurements to the body of God, and then later changed his mind. The problem is that later on, in one of his responsa, 117 in the Blau edition, Rambam explicitly denies that he ever believed in it. He said, Lam arakat, I never believed it. I never believed that it was written by one of the sages. The book should be erased and its memory cut off. So perhaps the problem was then not then that Rambam changed his mind, as Altman and the others suggested. He changed his mind, initially believing in the Shi'ur Koma, later denying it. But perhaps the problem was that he saw that his earlier formulation had misled people causing grave misunderstanding. If even among contemporary great scholars could misunderstand him, then all the more so the people in his own day. And therefore he needed to make a correction. The correction, however, was not a change of mind. It was simply to clarify, I never believed that. Lem arakat. And maybe the reason he said it would require so many pages was because a popular text required a very thorough, extensive, and lengthy refutation as false. And so again, do we have here a discrepancy? Do we have here an explicit change of mind? Or rather, do we simply have him coming to understand that he had to clarify, that's not what I meant, you're wrong? And so, what about esoteric writing by omission, by deliberate concealment? We started with the question in general of Rambam's esoteric writing and Goodman and Lieberman's rejection of the fanciful speculations of Leo Strauss. This led us to the question of what is not said, which is no less important than what is said. In turn, specifically on the controversial proofs of God and creation, and then Rambam's reference to Shiur Koma, we raised the question as to whether Rambam became aware of certain difficulties and his need not to change his mind later, a possibility he explicitly denied in the case of the guide, but later to correct misunderstandings by others to clarify his own earlier positions. So, was then Rambam aware of some of these problems, as suggested by Falakera in his criticism of proving God on the basis of creation, a false premise? Was Falakera correct that Rambam was aware of these problems? So let me conclude with a question. Again, in Guide 217, Rambam argued that the nature of something in the state of potentiality is different from its nature in the state of actuality, and no inference can be made ex post facto from something in its actual state to something before it exists, in actuality, in the state of potentiality. Just as the necessary condition of life, the example that he brings, breathing, air, and so forth, are not present for a fetus in the womb. Aristotle, according to Rambam, had made the mistake of exactly such an invalid inference, and Rambam suggests, that's what Rambam suggests, that Aristotle made that kind of invalid inference. So my question then is twofold. First of all, if cosmological proofs, whether of creation or of eternity, are logically invalid, methodologically invalid, because of their mistaken inference about something in about a state of potentiality from a later state of actuality, ex post facto, how can one employ cosmological arguments to prove not only eternity or creation of the cosmos, but the existence of a first and unmoved mover or prime cause? If you can't deduce from the laws of nature how nature itself came to be, a kind of illegitimate metaphysical ex post facto argument, how can you make the greater jump and deduce from those laws of nature anything about the existence of God, who presumably by definition, in any event, transcends nature and its laws? In short, if you can't prove creation of the cosmos, how can you prove its transcendent creator? And second, is it too far-fetched to wonder whether Rambam was aware of this predicament in his own thought? Is, as possibly Falakera has suggested in a different context, is this, in short, yet one additional case of deliberate pedagogic or concealment discrepancy? Regardless of how we attempt to answer these questions, or whether there even is an answer to these questions, we're all grateful for the new wonderful translation and extremely instructive notes by Len Goodman and Philip Lieberman, and the thoughtful companion, The Guide to the Guide. Toda rabba.
Sure. Am I on mute? Where am I? Oh, I see. So I'm on
videos here. So if you talk, they should be able to.
But I'm trying. How do I unmute myself on this?
It's
not.
unmuted. The audio's going.
But so why am I?
This is me. This is me.
Oh, that's you. Oh, so you're okay. 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 Thank you very much, Professor. A fascinating presentation, and I actually have what to continue on from the cosmological question, which I will address later. So I'm very excited about that. Okay. Do we have questions on this presentation? In the room.
Does that mean I've been perfectly understood or that nobody understood? Or that everybody agrees or that nobody agrees?
Yes, Professor Siskin.
What's going on here?
I can't hear.
He can't hear. Would you like to come just over here?
All right, thank you for a very informative presentation. I think what's going on here is a constructive dilemma. Namely, if the world is eternal, then God exists. That's his 26-step proof. If the world is created, then God exists. Because if there's creation, there has to be a creator. Therefore, God exists. In other words, no, you can't prove creation, according to the Rambam. But the way he has set this up, you can certainly conclude that God exists. In fact, you have to conclude it because either side of the dilemma leads to that conclusion.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. That is clearly his methodological and pedagogical preference for using eternity over creation, as opposed to the standard kalam way of proving creation in order to prove the existence of God, which he criticizes. And it's clearly a better systematic approach because if there's creation, there's obviously a creator, but if there's eternity, then maybe not. So he uses eternity to say, well, okay, but even if there's eternity, there has to be a God. And kal vachomer, if there's not eternity, if there's creation, then there's obviously a God. But then in that case, why use cosmological proofs? Why not use other kinds of proofs, for example, ontological? And the proof of necessary being is more in the ontological area. So that would work better in that sense. But falakera has a point. If your premises are false, then you don't have a proof.
Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me. I want one more point.
You can't get you.
If I could just add one more point, that was the methodological preference for the way he did it. The pedagogical one is, okay, you're the perplexed student. You think that you've been exposed to philosophy, you've been impressed by philosophy. So I'll show you that even if you accept Aristotelian premises, I can still show you why there has to be a God. So there is a methodological and as well as pedagogical reason for doing it.
All right, he doesn't use the ontological argument. I think he gets close to it when he talks about the tetragram, but he doesn't use it. But you can get a conclusion, a valid conclusion from premises, one of which may be false if you just rely on the excluded middle. Namely, you have an exhaustive disjunction, and therefore one of the premises has to be false. But if one of them has to be false, the other has to be true. And since they both lead to the same conclusion, the conclusion still stands. That's a perfectly valid argument.
Let me pick it up.
All right.
I'll add something to what Ken said. I think that Ken is right about the disjunction. I think Ken is right about the disjunction, and I think that's the way he presents it. He does concede that his defense of creation is dialectical rather than certain. and that would explain why he wants to do the disjunction. The disjunction makes the argument comprehensive because either the world is created, in which case it must have a creator, or the world is eternal, in which case it must have a prime mover on the Aristotelian model. I want to go back, however, to the addition that he made in his own hand, and that's a very important point. I don't think that the addition is because he changed his mind. I think we agree about that, but there's some clarification needed. And I think the clarification that's needed is to recognize that the belief in creation is important to prophecy, miracles, and other things. So in the context of the 13 Articles of Belief, you need, I think he feels that he may have conceded too much in the guide to allowing, the argument, the Aristotelian argument, I think he does think it's valid, so long as that premise is granted, that namely the eternity of the world, because then you need a prime mover who operates with infinite duration or infinite power. But he doesn't want to leave the impression that creation is kind of on an equal footing with eternity, because he thinks his dialectical arguments, although they're only dialectical, are still pretty good arguments. He does put a lot of stress on his refutation of the invalidity of the that the philosophers have assumed that nature has always worked the same way it works now. They've projected the idea of possibility and potentiality. They've projected their idea of time. That's what his example of the person who doesn't know where babies came from and doesn't believe that you could be alive inside the womb and still not breathing, not defecating, not taking in food in the usual manner. He thinks that their defense of eternity is, in a way, dialectical also, because they presumed that nature has always operated necessarily as the way it does now, and so he wants to go back and shore up that possibility of creation. I think he wants to underscore it because it's very important, as he says elsewhere, about prophecy, about miracles, about other things that we all have to believe. With regard to the ontological argument, I think Ken is right. He comes very close to it, and I think he does mean to suggest it when he talks about the tetragrammaton. I think his intention there is to interpret Ehia Sherehia as a spelling out of the idea of God's necessary existence. And I see a connection there with the Muslim thinker Al-Ghazali, because Al-Ghazali thinks there's the strong don't have to rely on a cosmological argument. The strong of mind can rely on seeing God's existence in its own terms. This has a precedent in Philo and in many other thinkers before the Rambam, and I think he's inspired by Avicenna's idea of God as a necessary being to find that foreshadowed in God's self-revelation as a necessary being. Ehia Sherehia.
Thank you, Lynn. I'd like to simply point out that Wilson, in his great article on the proofs of God in Jewish philosophy, said that the ontological proof is not present in Jewish philosophy, and then he says, except for Rambam's fourth proof, which is close, or I don't remember the exact phrasing. So I think we're all in agreement that the fourth proof of necessary being, which is of course based on Mawjud al-Wujud of Ibn Sina, I think we're all in agreement that if it's not exactly the ontological proof in its Christian context, this classical Christian context, it certainly comes very close to it. However, Len, following up on his the point is that creation makes possible miracles, prophecy, and so forth. I think that it's significant that one of his arguments against the eternity of the universe is precisely that it makes for invariable necessity, and that doesn't fit with astronomical anomalies. And he uses astronomical anomalies that just can't be explained in terms of simple natural necessity and eternity in the Aristotelian sense. What's interesting is that he uses astronomy to point out that there has to be change, and that Aristotelian astronomy doesn't allow for that, and it doesn't fit the actual empirical facts. And in that sense, it's kind of parallel in a different way to Halevi rejecting Aristotle, but in his case, it's because Aristotle's theories can't account for historical facts. So for Rambam, Aristotle's eternity can't account for astronomical facts. For Halevi, it's for historical facts.
Any further questions? Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jospe.